Welcome back. I can see the networking is really happening. It's good to see, but I do need you to take your seats quietly as we are ready to get into our second panel of the day. So good to see so many familiar faces. Right. So as the rest of our colleagues make their way into the venue, I would like to start. The second panel of our conference is hosted by Elias Masilela, who is the chairman of DNA Economics. And he and his panel will be discussing disinvestment versus engagement in meeting climate change targets. Earlier on, it was already mentioned that we have not yet talked about ESG, of course, the E referring to the environment. And right now, it is a time for us to talk about how do we make sure we manage what is globally known as this issue of a just transition. How just is the just transition? All right, we've had our fair share of coverage of this topic in South Africa, talking about supporting fossil fuel industries. We've seen more and more financial institutions send out announcements and making quite resolute statements about when they will stop supporting fossil fuel industries. But we also know that these are the same industries that employ thousands and hundreds of thousands of people and support many, many families. It is still a primary source of energy in countries like our own and many others on the continent. How do we manage that, and what implications are there for this just transition in our investment decisions? Joining Elias on this panel is Sfiso Sbia. He's head of investments here at the GEPF. It's Kenneth Robertson. He's head of sustainable investing at Robeco. And Sasha Cook, who's head of sustainable finance at Standard Bank South Africa, as well as Tracy Davies, who's the executive director at Just Share. Mr. Chairman, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and welcome back to everyone. I may be wrong, but if I'm correct, you will then wear the same hat that I'm wearing to say that this is potentially the most complex and difficult topic on the agenda over the next 2 days. So in order to give it the attention it requires, we're going to apply what is called a controlled democracy. What that means is the panel is not going to do most of the talking. Most of the talking will come from the floor. We'll open with the panel, one round of introduction and questions together. And after that, just to manage expectations, we will then ask pension funds in the house, asset managers in the house, in particular those that have a view on the topic, to share their views with the house. We will then have a democratic discussion. So, if there are any views that are not raised by the end of today's discussion, please feel free to send your thoughts to the host, which is the GEPF. And I thought I would start off this by identifying what I see as keywords. That will give us an indication of whether we've covered everything that we're supposed to cover. One of the considerations when dealing with this topic is that you have to be as balanced as possible. You need to think about geographical context. You need to think about economic dynamics. You need to think about employment and unemployment. You need to think about growth. You need to think about fossil fuels as a sunset industry. And if these thoughts don't come up in the discussion, that means we haven't done things properly. And we also need to make sure that by the time we finish, we have a sense of what timeline as South Africa we should be working within when we talk of just transition. The North will be looking at 3 years, we may be looking at 20 years. How do we bridge the gap? And these are the things that we have to try and deal with today. So what I will do is, I will open the panel discussion by asking Usfiso to give us an indication of the thought process that is taking place within the GEPF. And he'll have to share with us what made him suggest this topic for the panel. And lastly, what keeps him awake at night when it comes to this topic. Sfiso, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and good morning to all the delegates here today. So, in terms of the topic itself, it's quite, I would say, important to be discussing such things, more especially because, there is a COP 28 happening soon, and the more such topics are discussed and debated, the more views are concrete, particularly in airing views, from the global south, as it were, where perspectives are probably not as understood as they should be. So maybe from a broad context as why this topic. So I'll preface that and say that the availability of cheap energy and abundant energy is crucial for societal development, right? And this becomes apparent when you observe history, that from your mid-1800s and 1760 in particular going forward, when the Industrial Revolution began. So you had the pace of development increase rapidly because of cheap energy and the technology thereof. This has fueled the development path and industrialization of many nations, particularly developed nations, and many could argue that that era of development has yet to be realized by other countries and jurisdictions. So when you then look at the data from sources such as the IEA of energy source and usage over time, you'll then see it in the data that the majority of energy by consumption is in coal, traditional biomass, oil, and that's fueled the development of what we're seeing today. So that's an undeniable fact. But however, you've got then the dilemma that fueling of development is causing harm to the environment. And what you have there is two risks that arise. So you have climate-related risks and the other one, which is limited availability. So I'll start with the climate risks. So these are, well covered and understood, but, to address them in particular, under the climate risks, you have damage to infrastructure. In particular, here in the Western Cape, we've had climate-related risks, and, there was significant damage to infrastructure. And the world over, we're seeing that as more climate-related events become, a more normal occurrence. So you have that. Secondly, under climate risk, you have then the impact on food production and food security in general, where crop patterns are changing, and when you have phenomena such as landslides, it then, compromises food security broadly. Then thirdly, under climate risk, you have inequality, right, where you have a phenomenon where countries and jurisdictions such as Africa in particular have a disproportionate impact when it comes to these sort of climate-related events, having contributed very little to the damage that is existing. So that then causes inequality and strengthens it. It makes it become structural. So that's climate-related risk. Similarly, then you have what I termed risks relating to limited availability. So fossil fuels are then finite. There is not an infinite amount of them available, and the less they are, the more valuable they become. So it has price implications. And that basically increases production costs, and it has adverse impacts on economies. Recently, over the past 2 years, we've been experiencing the effects of high commodity costs and what it can do to economies, because all of those spillover effects then affect your monetary policies going forward. So broadly, that's the environment. When you then consider the South Africa in particular, then it becomes more acute in terms of our energy dependency, et cetera, and we'll get to that probably at a later stage of the discussion. What I wanted to end off with is then you have this reality that because of our history as a society, fossil fuels have fueled societal development, but you also have the risks that arise. Then you have the disinvesting versus staying engaged as a dilemma. And obviously, depending on jurisdictions, that becomes, I'd say, a very nuanced discussion. In our environment in particular, we don't have a very large investment universe in the listed space, so disinvesting doesn't become an option. In fact, the analogy that I like using sometimes is that the fact that you clear trash from your house and it leaves your yard doesn't mean it disappears from Earth, right? And so doing, if we clear our portfolios from fossil fuel-based producers, et cetera, it doesn't mean that those entities disappear. And in fact, it may retard progress from ESG perspective, because there's no shortage of owners who will probably be not as diligent in terms of active ownership. So there then lies the discussion. You've got the harms, they're well documented, but you have the realities that we have. So that's the context of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I move to the next panelist, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rank that risk as an institution?
Climate risk, or both. So I would say under the climate risk that we discussed, we've got inequality there, we've got damage to infrastructure, et cetera, and our dependence on fossil fuels. So I'd say on a 1 to 5, probably 4.
4.
That it is something that we would have to start considering as an industry, as pension funds, as investment managers, and put some import on it and look at it critically.
Okay. No, thank you very much. I think this gets me to ask Sasha to give us an indication of how they think about this from a private sector point of view. In sustainable financing, it is argued that the financial sector is the sharpest instrument that you can use to either deal with climate change or worsen it because of the impact they have across the economy. How do you think about this at Standard Bank? And we've seen that recently you've had guests which were unexpected at your doors.
We have had guests. Thanks, Elias. So maybe just to take a step back in positioning how the group is looking at this. We published our inaugural climate policy in March 2022. And I think there are a couple of key principles that I just want to outline that really talk to the bank's approach to this topic. So we've made certain commitments, net zero commitments, in terms of our own operations by 2040. More importantly, in terms of our financed emissions, we've committed to net zero by 2050. And to your point, as a financial institution, as one of the largest banking and financial services organizations across the continent, we have the ability to influence and drive change through how we mobilize capital. So that really talks to our portfolio of financed emissions. And our climate policy speaks to the group's fair contribution to a just transition. And I think that's really important. It also talks to a common but a differentiated approach. So there are some true north goals, and those are global goals. We're talking about the Paris Agreement and some of the key goals or aspirations within that. But there is a differentiated approach, and you mentioned this in your opening remarks. What does that look like? Is it 3 years? Is it 10 years? And there's no simple answer. It differs across each of the 20 countries in which we operate in across the continent. So this is hugely complex. But very broadly, our climate policy speaks to two complementary mechanisms. On the one hand, we have made certain reduction commitments, or there are reduction targets, and those are in relation to the higher emitting sectors. We're talking about coal, oil, gas, and there's certain other sectors that we're looking to bring in on a phased approach. And there we've made reduction targets over a period of time in terms of reducing exposures as a percentage of the overall book. And on the other hand, we have, and as part of that, we have also made commitments such as we will not finance new coal-fired power stations. So that sits within the reduction target side of the commitments. And then there are positive mobilization targets, and those focus on sustainable finance. So we've made a commitment to mobilize over a 5-year period in excess of 250 billion rand in sustainable finance. And that really is financing that has positive impact. And to be clear, there are frameworks that govern this, because you might ask the question, what is sustainable finance? Is it just because I wake up one morning and feel like something looks like sustainable finance? There are very clear taxonomies and frameworks that we look to align with, that really talks to the credibility. And within that sustainable finance target, there is a specific target to finance renewable energy powered plants. And that's a 3-year target of 65 billion between 2022 and 2024. So that talks to a specific focus around mobilizing for positive impact. And I think that's really important. I don't think it's, we talk about things being black and white. In this instance, maybe we're talking about the difference between green and brown. There's many, many, many murky shades in between. And I think that it is really important that both of those mechanisms are working together to shift the shape of the portfolio and the emissions of the finance portfolio over a period of time. So I think very broadly that is our approach. I'm sure we will get to this, but there's a lot of clarity around, there's a lot more clarity around what is considered green and what is considered brown. But like I said, there's many shades in between. So the process of engaging with clients that operate in browner sectors and understanding their transition strategies, how credible those are, and how we can support them on that transition journey is a critical part, I think, of this journey, and certainly something that we are focusing on. So, and that falls within this transition finance space, which is got certainly less clear boundaries and parameters.
I thought you were going to talk about the guests that you received.
So, we, as an organization, really value engaging with multiple stakeholders. Tracy, sitting just to my left, will know that there's been multiple engagements that she's had with the bank and with the group over a number of years. And I guess this is no different. We do welcome the engagement. I suppose it's challenging when it gets to a point where that engagement becomes disruptive to employees and to clients. But I think the position remains. We really welcome and value engagement from stakeholders across the board.
Thank you very much. And I think it's in line with the Red October campaigns, Berlin. I just need to check something. On the financing of coal-fired power stations, is that an immediate decision? Is a decision to be implemented immediately, or is it going to be phased in over time? And depending on what your answers is, can you reconcile that with your definition of just transition?
Yeah, so that decision was immediate in terms of the 2022 policy when it was released. And we were clear in the policy that we would continue to support existing clients, but we felt that in the context of driving some of the change that is needed in terms of ultimately reaching a goal of having a net zero commitment by 2050, to continue to finance new coal-fired power plants was not in line with that.
Thank you very much. And I think this gives us a very good transition to Tracy. As you introduce yourself, Tracy, I would like you to give us a sense of whether or not social justice is under threat, particularly if just transition is defined as a short time frame or within a short time frame. And how do you deal with conflicts in that regard, particularly between the North and the South?
Thanks, Elias. Just to introduce myself, my name is Tracy Davies, and I'm the Executive Director of a non-profit shareholder activist organization called Just Share, and we are working to catalyze the private sector in South Africa, particularly the financial sector, to use its power to combat climate change and to reduce inequality. And of course, this debate about divestment versus engagement is not a new one. It's probably been the topic of conference panels for a good 15, 20 years, but of course no resolution has been found yet. And I think I just want to preface my response to your comment, Elias, by saying that, I think it's fair to say, given the global context that we are living in, climate scientists yesterday released the global temperature anomalies for the month of September. And their scientific conclusion about those anomalies globally was that they are gobsmackingly bananas. So nothing we've done, no divestment policy, no engagement policy, has come close to achieving the kind of action we need at a global level to tackle climate change. And from a social justice point of view, that is, as Safisa said, he made clear that climate change is not an environmental issue. It's fundamentally an issue of social justice and of economic impact, and we're seeing that across the globe now. So we often hear this statement by asset managers that they need to engage because this is how they can drive companies to behave better. This is how they can achieve the just transition. And that is all very well if you actually do engage and you don't just say that you're engaging without changing anything. But it's not apparent to me that any of the financial sector positions on this issue have social justice at heart. Because we talk about the need to transition more slowly in South Africa because of our reliance on fossil fuels and because of our dire economic situation. But a huge reason for our dire economic situation is our reliance on fossil fuels, as the Minister of Finance made quite clear this morning. And doubling down on that reliance is certainly not going to help us to achieve any level of social justice in this country. We also just talk about electricity as if it's a standalone issue, but the burning of fossil fuels in this country has massive social impacts. There are hundreds of thousands of people who live in Mpumalanga who don't have electricity, by the way, but who are suffering and dying from the pollution that is generated by Eskom's coal-fired power stations and by the coal mining operations that support it. So you may say that we need to slow down the transition in order to achieve social justice. But the failure to transition, the failure to grasp the urgency of the need to transition is one of the fundamental causes of injustice in this country, as it stands already. But thinking about the future from a divestment engagement perspective, and because this is obviously a very financial sector-oriented audience, we see this engagement to mean one thing, really, in South Africa from a big asset manager perspective, and that is we talk. We talk and we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk, and we have the same outcomes over and over again, and we let the fossil fuel industry string us along for years and years and years because we have a small investment universe and because we need a slow transition and because we're reliant on fossil fuels. And this is not engagement. This is a cop-out. And if you say that you're engaging with the fossil fuel industry in order to improve economic outcomes and to support the just transition, then it has to involve a heck of a lot more than just sitting around a table and talking to executives. It must include robust escalation strategies, voting against directors, filing shareholder resolutions, denial of debt funding if that's appropriate, and ultimately also the threat of divestment. And we really don't see any of South Africa's big asset managers exercising any of these options in a robust way. So engagement which doesn't seek to achieve transformative change is greenwashing. But engagement which is part of a strategy to achieve transformative change can be effective. And from that perspective, divestment can be the most crucial element of engagement. But up until now, in South Africa, we're not making any progress either by engaging or divesting. We're just allowing the fossil fuel companies to lead us a merry dance.
You clearly have support. I'm sure you're aware that Jan Mahlangu is not with us here. Should I burden you? A question that I was going to ask Jan Mahlangu if he were here was, as we engage as social agents, taking into account issues of balance and all, how do you ensure that we have a just transition that does not destroy jobs? And what will be the role of those people responsible for employees on the shop floor or factory floor to stay engaged with just transition?
So I think that the people who are most likely to be impacted by the transition away from coal, have a very valid complaint. And that is that they feel that they are not being included in the conversation. And I think that that's fair. There's a lot of techno-economic discussion about the transition. There's a lot of discussion about energy and about the kind of government policy around energy. But no one is really talking to those people about what is going to happen to them. And that is a problem. And that is why unions have such a crucial role to play in engaging with government and with the private sector on this issue. But just remember that, we talk about the just transition, but very seldom do we really think about what that just part of it means. And very seldom do any of the plans and proposals and discussions about energy really take into account that element of justice. And that's not just justice for coal miners and people who work in coal-fired power stations. That's justice for all the people across the rest of the country who are already either unemployed because of the energy crisis or who are going to lose their jobs as a result of climate impacts. 30,000 people in the Western Cape lost their jobs over the period of the Day Zero drought. We don't talk about them in just transition conversations. We don't talk about the 110,000 people employed in the automotive sector who stand to lose their jobs when European countries stop importing internal combustion engines from South Africa. So justice, the point of the just transition, is that it should ensure that all of those people who have traditionally been left behind in our economy have a say in the table, that they have access to energy so that they can work, so that we can create jobs. But this concept of a just transition becomes co-opted by politicians and vested interests in the private sector who say justice means going slowly. Don't touch our vested interests. We've got to still make our profits. It's still got to be affordable for us. You've just got to ask yourselves, every time you hear one of those arguments about taking the transition slowly, ask yourself whether those people really care about the guys at the bottom of the coal mine, the people living in shacks under the Eskom power stations, the people working in the automotive factories in PE and KZN, the agricultural workers in the Western Cape. Are they really the people that are being focused and centered by this transition? They are not, and that is why the unions are up in arms.
Thank you very much. You want to come in?
Sorry,
Sasha?
can I ask a question? I tend to agree with you on the lack of focus on the just or the social aspects of this transition. I mean, this is not a question for you necessarily, but just a question. What is the role in, what role does government or policy or regulatory reform play here? There are certain areas where there's slightly more challenges for the private sector to play, or maybe there's some catalytic mobilization of capital that may be required in order to start to mobilize private capital. I mean, as I say, it's not specifically a question to you, but just a question, because I think that is really critical as well. If you look at the Just Energy Transition Plan for South Africa and the COP commitments, you know, the global commitments that have been made, there's a place for those to start to drive some of the social impact projects around retraining, reskilling, rehousing. There's a need to provide people with an alternative means to support themselves, whether that's agri, whether it's potentially renewable energy or other sources outside of coal, particularly in those areas. So it's an interesting discussion, and it's not that I disagree with you, but I'm just wondering about the role that government plays relative to, or in addition to, or to help to catalyze some of the private finance.
Do you want to make a comment? I can also check who's on the floor from government. We did observe that they were not on the panel. It's impossible to conclude this discussion without a policy discussion. So if there's anybody on the floor, raise your hand. Meanwhile, Tracy, if you have a comment to make. Or Kenneth, you look like you want to say something.
No, Tracy, go first.
Okay, I'll just quickly respond and then. Of course, policy is crucial. But, you know, to what extent is the private sector then supporting policies around the just transition versus either not saying anything or hindering those policies because they themselves are ambivalent about fossil fuels? And I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're seeing a private sector that potentially sees huge financial upsides in things like gas, for example, oil and gas, offshore oil and gas exploration, which is obviously very difficult to align with the concept of a just energy transition. And so we see, we see policy incoherence in the private sector as well as at government level, and that is a huge problem, of course it is.
I think just to add to that, I think it's going to be incredibly important what comes out of COP28 in terms of government support and also in terms of financing. Because it's been alluded to before, this problem has been created in the north, in the global north. And it's now falling on people who didn't cause the problem to fix it. So I think to some extent there really needs to be an honest conversation at a policy level about who then pays for this transition. And particularly as they started in COP26 in Glasgow, particularly a discussion around how people, or how politicians of the West are able to some extent fund the transition in the global south.
You're already on the floor, but I'll give you a pause. I just want to check with FISO. Do you have a sense of what government is thinking? You are not representing them. Just a sense.
I can tell you what the GPF is thinking, and I think I've done that. Yeah, so I'd say it is, a huge issue, as mentioned earlier on, when you say ranking from 1 to 5, and I said 4. But I'd want to pause and think about, from a South African point of view, the implications, for example, of a just transition, if done very rapidly. So broadly, it's not mutually exclusive, but 5 categories. So you would have what I termed physical risks and stranded assets. We have, I'd say, a unique challenge where you have ownerless and derelict mines, where, if operating environment becomes too expensive for whatever way or form, we have a phenomenon where the owners of the operations basically up and leave. That has massive societal implications, and we've been experiencing that as a country. It's called Amazamazama, for example. And it's well covered in the news. Secondly, you have also the environmental side of it, where mines become, pollutants because, things are not maintained and, there's no rehabilitation done, etc. And secondly, you have an impact around natural resources, right? With the transition, metals, the so-called transition metals, will start to become extremely valued. You have, your rare earths, etc., and there'll be a stampede for those resources. And then add on top of that speculation, which generally happens in financial markets, and you'd have, a resource run, which would have also other societal implications where, big pools of capital maybe find themselves in places where there's probably little or limited governance. Then you have the human and social impact, which we spoke about at length around livelihoods, community displacements, etc., where, you have big mining houses or communities or mining-based communities. If, those operations shut down, those communities will be displaced, etc. Then lastly, around governance, I think what should, and, you're seeing some forms of this with, the green taxonomies and things like that, which I think National Treasury did publish last year or so. There needs to be uniformity as to how different jurisdictions deal with this. Otherwise, you have regulatory arbitrage, right, where places without proper regulations, definitions, etc., that's where all the pollution is going to happen. But in my yard, there's no trash. And that doesn't help us as a society. So broadly, those are the issues that capture our thinking with regard to this. So it's not government, but it's our thinking. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sfiso. Dondo, I would like you to think about something. I'll come back to you at a later stage. Just remember, try and think back to when you were in government, what the thoughts were. And the question that I have is, are we ready for just transition? There is money that has been offered by the world to South Africa to run a pilot, which is supposed to be a global benchmark pilot. Are we going to be able to have the right absorptive capacity for that capital to implement and deploy as properly, as expected? It's something that I think we need to think about, but you can come back to that at a later stage. Kenneth, you spent quite some time on global fora, engaging, thinking about these issues.
Yeah.
Can you share with us what South Africa should be focusing on in terms of preparing itself and trying to implement as optimally as possible, thinking about the short to long-term strategy of how we do this, and how we bridge the gap between the North and the South with respect to how we think about those challenges and how we interpret what is just or not just in the transition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I speak to kind of more global institutions, I think there's three things, broadly speaking, that are underway in the finance industry as a whole with regards to sustainability. I think number one, we've spent probably the last 10 years defining sustainability as ESG. So sustainability risk, all I'm looking at there is how does sustainability impact my portfolio? And then I want to adjust my valuation, right? It says nothing about the sustainability of the broader portfolio. So I think we're seeing that transition to much more consideration of double materiality and real world impact. I think that's number one. Number two is climate as an issue is now completely dominant. So yes, ESG is many, many, many different things and to some extent means something different to everyone. But climate is the one commonality. So that's why you've seen the explosion of net zero commitments around the world. And the third one, and this is where it really starts to get interesting, the third one is regulation. Now, and particularly something called SFDR in Europe, so the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, because it's a very, very, very misunderstood piece of regulation. What it is effectively a disclosure standard, where I have to disclose certain standardized sustainability information about my fund. Okay, not particularly interesting. But if you actually read the regulation and you consider more broadly what it's actually trying to achieve and what it's actually part of in the broader sense, this is regulators in Europe asking European pension funds to actually get involved in funding the Paris Agreement and also in the funding the Sustainable Development Goals. So they are explicitly asking us to get involved. And I think that's a trend that we're going to see more broadly outside of Europe continue to happen. So those would be the three things. I think when we speak specifically about climate, does divestment work in terms of that real-world impact argument? I personally don't think it does. I would have the easiest job in the world talking to clients about sustainability. If we dropped 3% of the index weight of the MSCI ACWI, you can drop the carbon footprint 50%. Portfolio looks lovely on a fact sheet, but that actual action has A, zero real-world impact on carbon, and B, you can argue actually has negative social impact in terms of jobs lost, etc. But I strongly, strongly, strongly agree with Tracy that we have to keep divestment as a tool on the table, because I don't think you can have a credible engagement strategy if at the end of that engagement, when it's not successful, you're prepared to walk away. So we have an exclusion list. We do have selective divestment, but preceded by a very structured engagement program. I also agree that actually there's so many steps in between, right? We're talking about these two things that are polar opposites, but you have to go through a series of steps to get from one to the other. So I also think, as mentioned, look at managers' voting practices. Look at how supportive or not they are of shareholder proposals. Look at how supportive or not they are of, say, on climate resolutions. There's a whole series of steps that you as a shareholder, as a bondholder, have available to you to get your views across to management and actually to help in that transition. So, look, this is incredibly complicated. I think what I would say is that, it's incumbent on asset owners, on pension funds, on everyone in this room to basically set these clear expectations of your manager. Ask them what they're doing from a carbon budget perspective. Ask them what their engagement strategy is. Ask them if that's credible. How many people do they have working in their engagement team? So I think if you do that, then we will start to see the industry shifting.
Okay, thank you very much. I was listening very attentively there. It sounds like there is already experience in this. A question that arises to me is, are these trigger points where you have to use your tool objective, such that you can be able to agree on both sides that you've actually reached the point where you can pull the trigger?
Sorry, what was the question?
So you're talking, you've argued to keep divestment
Yeah.
as a tool
Yeah.
if things fail. And the question is, are those trigger points identifiable, quantifiable, and agreed, such that when you have to pull a trigger, there's expectations that are met on all sides?
Yeah, so let's be clear about how we define engagement, right? This is not about sending a letter once a year,
Okay.
you know, it's very much has to be structured, has to be intense. You have to be speaking to the company multiple times a year, and you also need to have objectives, right?
Okay.
So we make that clear up front. Yes, this is what we're looking for. By the way, we also make a small caveat between our expectations on developed market companies and emerging market companies. We treat them slightly differently, and we do allow slightly more time for these expectations to be met for EM. But you have to make that clear up front, right? Because it's ultimately, you're leading down a pathway which could end up in divestment. So yeah, of course, you have to be clear with the company about that.
All right. Thank you very much. I think the table has been laid. I'm going to move to the floor now. By show of hands, excluding the GEPF, pension funds in the room. Who are the pension funds in the room? Both South Africa and offshore. Okay, amongst the pension funds that are in the room, how many hold a position or have a policy stance on the subject? Stand up. Those who have a policy stance, please stand up. Okay. I don't see a South African fund, or am I seeing wrong? May I request that you stay standing, or you keep standing? Stay standing. Please stand up. May I request, starting from the left to the right, stay standing. I'll give you a minute each to state your policy position. And after you've stated your policy position, you can sit down. We'll start with the gentleman here and move left. Yeah.
So ours is to divest and or replace with cleaner sources by 2027. From my standpoint, it's a line in the sand, because what I've told my trustees is that the investment community will innovate, and it's already happening because of what's happening, what President Biden, the policies that he's put in place and the incentives that are in place through legislation. We're starting to see very innovative funds come up with solutions that'll help us move towards our goals. So similar to what I saw with infrastructure 10 years ago, very limited sources in terms of investable opportunities. Fast forward to today, just a more dynamic range of investable opportunities. That will be the same case. We're all talking about divesting today, but we don't know what opportunities we could be investing in 10 years from now. So I am holding the line on 2027, but have the option to move it further so that I have better opportunities to invest into other things that, you know, again, I am of a belief I don't want to divest. Energy has been recently has returned very well. Not so much last year, but the prior years it did too. So I have trustees who said, don't divest. We want to be invested in the full range of opportunities that are available to us, especially for a 47% funded plan. So that's our position. And that's my take on where we want to be and how we want to look at the opportunity set going forward.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Can you remind me the fund?
I'm with the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. It's an $11.5 billion fund, and I represent all the teachers who are teaching the Chicago public school systems.
Thank you. Introduce the fund first.
Los Angeles City Employees Retirement System. My name is Rod June. I'm the Chief Investment Officer. So the fund I work with now has an ESG risk framework as well as a responsible investment policy. We, our members, are a signatory to PRI. And as a result of that signatory status, we went forward and created policy addressing divestment versus engagement. It is the belief of our board at Lacers that engagement is far more effective than divestment. We feel that if we have a voice at the table, that we can effectuate change, not necessarily overnight, but over a period of time. I will say that the policy that we have in place does lack real teeth, meaning that while we say we engage, we really don't engage. And I think that was a point that was brought up by Tracy, that one can say in policies or frameworks that engagement is more important than divestment, but are you really engaging? And what is it that will cause one to actually create or effectuate change over time? With that said, I did work for another public pension plan in the United States where it was not along climate change, but along social change, and it had to do with Sudan divestment, going back about 15 years. We had a policy in place at that plan where if after engagement over several courses of exchanges of correspondence, if that was ineffective, then the plan could divest from those securities. And so I was involved with actually divesting from 2 companies because those companies failed to respond to any engagement efforts that were initiated by that plan. So that was very real, and that all happened within the course of approximately a year and a half, where failure to engage with our plan meant that the board could take action to divest, and they did. And so we did initiate divestment. So it can be done. It's a lot of work, and it does pose, I think, certain risks to the plan. But those decisions were ultimately made by the board after we had presented information on the company's failure to engage and what it meant to continue to hold that company. So for those who have never experienced having to divest, I have that experience. Happy to share with you the process from that other plan that I used to work for. But it can be enacted and it can be very real. Whether or not that company decided to change, I don't think so. But I think it sent a clear statement to those companies that there are shareholders, asset owners who do care about this. And their failure to engage with the shareholders can have consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There were 3 more on this table.
Good morning. I'm from Los Angeles County Retirements Association. Much like Rodney June spoke, we have a very similar policy. It is not, and I'm speaking from a trustee standpoint, who looks at the policy, and in making our decisions, we also think about the impact to our members' investments and how our members will look at what we have done. Divestment is one thing, but does divestment cause us to lose a return on our investment, therefore affecting those benefits that we have promised our members? And so there has to be sort of a balance between talking about divestment and engagement, as opposed to how it affects our members. And that's how I look at it as a trustee.
My name is Lawrence Bosley. I'm from the New York City Employees Retirement System, and we run about $88 billion. We had a process with a consultant over a course of about 3 years on how we could divest. And the reason we even thought about divestment was because we had been involved with engagement for quite a number of years, and we were not getting the results we thought we should get. After that process, we were given several options as to how to divest. We dealt with Scope 1, Scope 2, and we left out Scope 3 because it was much too difficult to figure out how to, get away from those investments because they're entangled with so many other kinds of investments. We were looking at, as a board member, we were looking at reputational risk. We were looking at the hypocrisy of making, engaging in ESG with all of our asset managers, and then we're not engaging in ESG from the standpoint of we're continuing to invest in polluting assets. We also thought about the long term for our retirees. If they're living in a world where pollution is destroying their environment and the way that they live, how good is that check? And we also recognize that we're fiduciaries, and we certainly were being responsible in where we divest from. We can't divest from everything, as I stated before, but we're very concerned about also a leadership position as being like the third or fourth largest, depending on the day, fund in the country. We were hoping that CalSTRS and CalPERS and some of the other funds would follow behind us, begin to divest and let Exxon and Total and all of those other places that we're investing in and that are polluting the earth, let them know that we're really serious about this and really hurt their pockets and give them a reason to want to start making a change to sustainability. What was the last point I wanted to make? And we're also not market timers, so we're not trying to figure out when we should change from fossil fuels to sustainability. We just decided we're going to start working on sustainability issues as opposed to waiting and trying to time out when the oil prices begin to dip.
Hi, I'm John Gluzak from the New York City Controller's Office, and I am the investment advisor and investment manager for the we call them 5 systems. Larry's system is one of them. That's the New York City Employees Retirement System. We also have the New York City Teachers, New York City Police, New York City Fire, and the Board of Education employees. And there is a vast divergence among all those boards. Basically 2 are for and 3, 3 are for and 2 are against. And just to give you the other side of New York City politics, the 2 that don't believe in divestment, for the same reason I believe the gentleman said, is it really has negligible impact whatsoever, are severely underfunded, and they believe that their members are a priority and are looking forward to a reduction in ranks, excuse me, a reduction in ranks, the rank and file going forward, because nobody wants to, do the jobs of a policeman and a fireman. So you'll have less money coming in to pay the retirees, and this is a tool that they, don't really believe in. However, there is uniform agreement, and when we get to the social part, we have a responsible contractor policy. And that policy says, if you, Mrs. Manager, invest in companies that could lose public jobs, don't pay fair wages and fair benefits, we're not going to invest in you. So I think, nobody really mentioned kind of the social part, but we're pretty proud of that. And then we are working on, which will be rolled out later, a tenant's bill of rights if you will, to kind of give managers notice, and this is how you should treat your tenants, and this is how we expect our money to be invested with you. So I think there's push and pull on the environmental side, but on the social side, I believe all five are lined up.
Thank you very much. I was supposed to come back to my panel so that they can comment on what they heard, but in the interest of time, I would like to go to do the second wave before they may comment. May I see asset managers in the room?
Mr. Elias, one more
Oh, is
person.
there one more? Sorry.
That's okay.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Alicia Bonner from Fresno County Employees Retirement Association. And I think although we have policies in place within our own plan, we are collectively as trustees, because I am an elected trustee in California, we as trustees are coming together to build a more voice to hold our investment firms, our investment associations accountable for the investments they are making. So I just wanted to say that. We are doing coalition efforts.
Thank you very much. Asset managers in the room. It must be more than this. Those asset managers who have a policy position on this and advise their clients accordingly, please stand up. Okay, Andile, what?
Repeat it.
I never know what I say. I just said it. I can't remember what I said. What did I say?
Asset managers.
Okay. I have 4 asset managers who have a position. 5, 6.
Reluctant.
All right? 7. Starting with the gentleman at the back, please remain standing. 1 minute, state your position, and then we'll move to the right. At the end, I'll ask Dondo to close for us with what he thinks is the government thinking. Sure, you may go ahead.
Sean Morris, Coronation Fund Managers. I mean, we strong believers in engagement. We do feel that if you divest, you lose your seat at the table. I think that's been quite widely talked about. But one must always remember that shareholders are, you're not a very strong stakeholder. So engagement is tough. We believe that engagement must be done by the most senior of individuals. We involve the very seniorest people within the business. But the one critical thing is measurement of carbon. And, measurement is very poorly done. TCFD, many corporates haven't signed up for that. And if you can't measure it, there's very little you can do about it with respect to engagement. So we've embarked on an extensive project to ensure that measurement is done. I think the next step in that is that measurement must be audited in some way, shape, or form, because we know that if there's just a subjective measurement of your carbon emissions, you're not really measuring anything. But South Africa is a very nuanced place. We're at a critical juncture in terms of where the economy is, so one has to be very careful with the engagement. If you put corporates under pressure, you could potentially lose jobs. And as has been said, it's always a balancing act, and we've got to put members first. It's about generating decent returns for our members. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. The lady in white.
Thank you. Nicole Martins from Old Mutual Investment Group. So we absolutely have a policy on this. We keep divestment as the ultimate end tool, right, after our engagement process. We have signed up to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, so we're aiming to get our portfolio to net zero. We'd like to do that in a way that encourages real-world decarbonization, as opposed to, as was mentioned, just making our portfolio look good on paper. As part of that, we engage with companies on company-specific strategies, but also on systemic issues, including the just transition to net zero. One thing that I will say is that we also are very conscious of the fact that our engagements and the impact thereof are very limited as a single manager. So the next frontier for us is really around collaboration. So we work with our clients, and I know some of them are here, on their own net zero targets, on incorporating that into the mandate, on holding their managers accountable. We collaborate with the companies in which we invest on their strategies and trying to get those up to standard. And we collaborate increasingly with our peers in the industry on issues that make more sense to engage collaboratively. And I think one of the things that we're also doing at the moment is that, I mean, intuitively, we obviously engage and steward all the assets that we manage, but we also steward assets that we don't manage as a way to help sort of asset owners have one consistent voice in their stewardship approach, so that your engagement efforts that happen on your behalf by various managers don't cancel one another out. So really for us, it's about the collaboration, which is what's missing, and I think is really the thing that's been inhibiting impact in this market, is this reluctance to work together on issues that really affect everyone.
Thank you very much. The lady in black.
Thank you. I'm Tsitsi Hatendi Matika from 91, and on our side, we have ESG embedded in all our processes, so in all our investment teams and everything that we do. Sustainability is completely separate, but as an organization, we're working together to make sure that these things interact, and also making sure that engagement is top priority for us. So disinvest is definitely not our first tool. We believe that that engagement not only makes it richer for our clients, but also for the communities in which we operate globally. And our CEO is also our champion, where he is part of multiple forums on a global platform to also stand for South Africa and not just for the company. And yeah, we truly believe this is the best way to go about it.
Thank you. The gentleman here, just in front of us.
Hi, I'm Saad Sheikh from Enco Capital, an asset manager based out of London, but significant presence in Africa. We have a very proactive approach to all of the areas that you've talked about, from backward-looking ESG perspective to forward-looking impact perspective. Environment is a fundamental component of our investment strategy. So our proactive approach is the product we're giving to our clients is that it incorporates some of the key issues we're seeing in the market, from gender lens investing to environment-focused infrastructure investment, from creating governance at the portfolio company level through not only engagement, but proactive engagement and also technical assistance. So our investors will provide technical assistance to support those portfolio companies which otherwise don't have the means to and don't see the value initially to incorporate that. So we're putting all of that as a collective and cohesive product and offering that as an impact addendum to the commerciality within our investments. So it's commercial plus impact, which I think is very, very important on the African continent, where I think we've talked about risk premium being applied to Africa, and that needs to come down, and that will come down through effective returns and creating the impact that we talk about. So we're very, very proactive in our engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are three more inputs, and then we'll come back to Dondo.
Yeah, Ria Daniels from Alawani Capital. We do have a policy that's actually integrated into our investment process. So we definitely look at the ESG components embedded in the way we actually look at investments first and foremost. And then, of course, we all got a responsible investing framework as well. Having said that, I mean, we're on the same page of whereby we rather engage as opposed to disinvestment, but we won't put it on the table as examples, a lot easier in observation, particularly on the debt side, to be more effective. As mentioned by one of the speakers, what you find as a shareholder is very limited, but what we find, particularly on the debt side, it allows us a lot of leverage, particularly when firms come back to us for refinancing. And we've even opted on occasion to actually walk away from those deals. We had a key example of one company that actually was partially, in a very awkward way, having exposure to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and we actually turned our backs on that deal.
Start with the gentleman at the back, and then you come back here.
Hi, Elias and the panel. I'm Patrice Rassou from Ashburton Investments. I'd like to take a slightly different stance from the rest of my colleagues here and talk about what we've done at Ashburton. In terms of the investment pillar of the First Rand Group, this has been headed until probably yesterday by Mary Vilakazi, who's now Group CEO, and Duzin Lovu. So it's very important for First Rand in terms of what we do in the market. So our focus in terms of First Rand has been one of shared prosperity. And in asset management, we believe that the focus on the social aspect from a South Africa perspective have just been underemphasized. So over a decade ago, we launched the first and only job-focused credit fund in South Africa. We manage just over 10 billion in listed and unlisted credit. And we've been able, by sourcing catalytic capital, we've been able to create over 17,000 jobs for black women all over the country in various provinces. And these are jobs we'll be able to measure and really link our actions to funding enterprises which have been creating these jobs. And these have been permanent jobs, and it's audited and reviewed. So I think in terms of the approach, yes, we are signatories to the UN and PRI, but in terms of South Africa, I think we've been able to prove that you can deliver excellent returns, CPI plus 4, and not have to sacrifice on the social mandate. So rather, I wanted to share this example to say there's something which is important given our high unemployment rate in the country and how we as asset managers can really mobilize capital to make an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the very, very central and actually very interesting question, and actually very happy to hear the position of the gentleman before me, because I come from Meridian. We are an infrastructure developer, investor, and asset manager. And we very much share the same view that we don't need to sacrifice financial returns for ESG performance in our sector and infrastructure. We actually believe infrastructure can contribute to solve the social and environmental climate challenges we're talking about. So in terms of the policy and approach, clearly 100% policy around ESG themes, which is irrigating throughout the firm. So from ESG specialists down to investment professionals and people on the ground, portfolio companies, etc. We are a controlling investor, so we believe that we can implement the changes that we want to see happen in the companies by using our controlling rights. And we have, I would say, 3 pillars in our policy. First one on environment is all our funds have an objective to be aligned with a 2-degree scenario under the Paris Agreement. We believe we can make that happen by having a portfolio where, yes, there will be essential services, essential infrastructure that will, in essence, be carbon intensive. But then on the same portfolio, we will have other projects that will contribute to reducing emissions. And then what we offer to our investors is to invest in a portfolio that's overall 2-degree aligned. Second pillar is SDG, and echoing the first position, Yes, measuring your impact is extremely difficult, but we as a manager have sponsored a lot of initiatives to have the tools to monitor the impacts of our projects on the different SDGs. And the third pillar is when we develop a project, we want to make sure from the outset that we include the communities that we work with us, and that we co-build the project with them so that it's not only a good and a project that's having a positive impact on the SDG agenda of the country, but that the communities actually see the benefits for them and that we are able to track that. And finally, it doesn't stop at investment. It's a continuation and continuous improvement process. So even a company, and to echo the position on divestment, we don't believe in that at all. We think we have the means to actually change, being a controlling shareholder, improve practices, monitor what we do, and help support the project companies in improving their ESG performance.
Thank you very much. This was a very good set of inputs. I'm seeing hands coming up now, and the MC is telling me that I've chowed all my time. Can I give it to Dondo, and then we'll use controlled democracy, and you'll tell me if you want us to steal 5 to 10 or 10 minutes of your time. Dondo?
No, thank you very much, Elias. Maybe why, just to put it in context, until last year, I was the Permanent Secretary or Director General of Ministry of Finance in South Africa, so that those of you who don't know me. And I think he thinks I'm better placed to talk about this. Maybe yes. 15, 17 years ago, I was at the World Bank board, and I was there fighting, irritating Americans, the British, irritating the Germans, because we wanted the ESCOM loan, $3.75 billion. We got it at the end. What was our argument, including the current governor of the central bank, who was the DG at the time? We were saying, what do you expect us to do with our coal? We've got coal to fire us for 200 years. We're not going to throw it in the ocean. We're going to use it to fire ourselves. We got the loan at the end. Obviously, ESG, as it's understood today, was not, as prominent as it is now. Secondly, we are talking adaptation measures and mitigation measures that, the whole thing we had to have a full conversation, ensuring and knowing that we are where we were as a country, developing, and how coal has been important for us and so on. Another time, we were very arrogant. We used to say to them, look at Virginia, West Virginia, you're firing yourself, look at yourself in Europe and say, you can't come and dictate to us what we need to do. It made sense. We had to appeal to the emotions of, think about the World Bank board and what we were arguing at the time. And I had the support of Africa behind me for the 4 years that I was there. After that, fast forward to today, what are we then talking about? We had 3 Johns in the meeting. I forgot their names, surnames. There was a John from the EU, and there was a John from the US, and there was a John from EU, and the US, but in UK. And they were offering $10 billion, 9.8 or something. And I was in the room again, and I was called late, see these gentlemen, they introduce themselves and say, $10 billion available, And I was coming from the treasury background, our numbers were bad, Andile, at the time. I said, look, is it free money? Are we going to sort ourselves out from the challenges? No, it's going to be loans. And I knew it was going to be loans. It was going to be free money. $200 billion rent at the time, if you look at the exchange rate, 200 billion rent. We didn't need it. We said, no ways, sorry. And the challenge then was it's loans, it's going to add on our debt to GDP. Our debt to GDP was at 90%, almost 89% debt to GDP at the time. You add $200 billion, you had a problem. Fast forward to today, in terms of where I'm just telling what, the various periods in the last 10, 15 years. The final conversation now, in government, what we've seen recently and what we read in the newspapers, the Minister of Minerals Resources says, we've got enough coal. We cannot, we cannot. And we have a challenge then that says, there is just. Mpumalanga is in the eastern part of South Africa. It's a province, one of the 9 provinces. Now, the moment, and I'm not arguing, and the funny part is that I'm chairman of the board. I sit on Chapter 0 Southern Africa. I'm a board member there. It's a very funny arrangement. In my head, things are happening as I'm speaking about these things. And then Mpumalanga is going to be a ghost city, I can tell you, the moment we have to implement just transition the way that we want to, in the way that we choose to explain and approach this. What do we do with the coal? The same argument I made in 2006 at the World Bank, Lesich and I, and in Mpumalanga now we have a challenge. What do we do with the, Mpumalanga's economy is all about coal, nothing else, nothing else. But we have then real situations. We hosted COP, I forgot what COP it was. We hosted it here. And we've got obligations to ensure that future generations are protected. So it is, I'm saying all of these things, Elias, because there's no coherent view in the government system as to where exactly we should be. You speak to Enoch and myself and Treasury, then would tell you that, hey, I can't take 200 billion rand more for this. The Minister of Minerals says, hey, there's coal, you know, let's talk nuclear and coal also. And then there are views in South Africa that says we have to go clean, just transition, we have to fund. Who's going to fund it? If these were grants, I would have taken them when I was Director General. They were not grants. And the West, at the time, when I say the West, I'm saying to people who were in the room, were not prepared to convert these $10 billion into a grant for South Africa when we'll all be happy and smile. But they wanted to tick a box. I'm not being political here, and I'm not being, you know, what do you call it, you know, sensational about it. But they had to tick a box because the UK was holding some COP meeting there. And it was just unfortunate because some of these conversations are hard, but however, we have to be cognizant of the environment and the deterioration thereof. And we can see now, Cape Town is normally nice this time, but it's cold, it's winter, it's everywhere in one space. So I'm confusing you further. There's no view in the South African state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dondo. MC, I'm going to end it here. I know my panelists were waiting to comment on all these. So I will appeal that tonight over dinner, give them a chance to say something. But you can tell how complex the subject is and why it is important to put all our resources towards finding an answer to the questions that are facing us. Thank you very much. Thanks to the wonderful panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Elias, and your panel. Another round of applause for that panel. Thank you, sir. Yes, it's good. It's good when you can give the chairman some work to do. And it was well done, Mr. Chairman. You allowed us all to be part of the conversation. You instructed us to stand and share, and we are all complying. Well done. Thanks to all the participants and everybody who made sure they were there. And also to Sfiso, Kenneth, Sasha, and Tracy, thank you so much for your time and your input. Much appreciated. The conversations, I'm sure, will continue over lunch because it is now time to have a proper meal. We're going to be having lunch for the next hour or so. It is 13:23, so I need you back here at 14:23. Over lunch, I encourage you to connect some more, network some more, and continue this conversation of this just transition. And Dondo, you didn't confuse us. You gave us even more context of how complex this entire issue is. Ladies and gentlemen, it's lunchtime. Please enjoy. We'll be back in 1 hour exactly.